You should probably stop A/B testing. And I've been a data leader for a long time, so I know this is a crazy thing to say. I'm surprising myself by even saying it. And to be completely transparent, I might be wrong about this. It feels like an emperor has no clothes type of situation where so many smart people seem to think that the emperor has clothes on and that A/B testing is important, that coming out on the other side of that just feels a little crazy. But I started writing out issues that I've found with A/B testing as a data leader. And by the time I was done, I had put together a list of 18 different things that I thought were seriously wrong with A/B testing. And when I look at all of those 18 things, some of them theoretical and some of them practical, it's tough to look at the whole thing and think that we should still be doing it. In fact, it seems like we should just stop. But I might be wrong. So I'm asking you to listen to the case that I'm making and then share your point of view. Like I said, I might be wrong, but I thought this was too much evidence on the other side to not talk about it. To be very clear before I start, I'm not coming out against experimentation. In fact, it's the opposite. What I see with A/B testing is that we're doing far fewer experiments than we would otherwise and adding on meaningless complexity and false confidence around those experiments. The core argument against A/B testing, where a lot of this stems from, before I get into the 18 specific points, is that we've mindlessly copied a lot of experimentation methodology from academia and very strictly controlled clinical experiments into the business world, where it just doesn't fit. In hard science, you're trying to discover universal truths of things that don't change ever. And as a result, we set a very high bar for what everyone in the world considers as truth, and that once you have discovered the truth, it gets added to the body of knowledge of humanity, right? A/B testing for corporations is not that. It's very different than that. Businesses change all the time, and business decision-making it should be done in a very different way compared to how do we think about universal knowledge that is confirmed enough to enter into the sort of truths of humanity and the body of knowledge that other people cite and build on top of. And so with that, let's jump in. I've split the 18 points into 3 categories. And category number 1 is that A/B testing does not make business sense. Point number 1, 95% confidence interval does not make sense. In most A/B tests that people run for business decision making, you have a null hypothesis, which is stay the exact same. You make a change, and then you test whether that change turns out better for a metric across versus what you had before. And that's called testing the null hypothesis. And it's the most common way of doing an experiment in academia as well. And the threshold that we use for deciding that a change is good and that we can reject the null hypothesis, which is stay the same, is 95%. So if we're 95% sure that this change is better than what was there before, then we say, great, let's go and make that change. And if not, and we're not sure that the change is better than it was before, then we say, all right, the experiment failed. Again, this was mindlessly copied from academia and clinical research. Overwhelmingly, business decisions do not need to get to 95% confidence. In fact, I can't think of almost any business decision that I've ever made that I was 95% confident would work. You are looking at an unrealistic expectation of how confident you should be in order to make decisions. And if you look at only doing things where you're 95% sure that they're better, you're going to make many called type 2 errors, right? A type 1 error is when you do something wrong. You say, let's make this change, and it was part of that 5%, and it was actually worse. But a type 2 error is when you say, yeah, we didn't know if we should make that change, but actually that change was going to be good. So what is the threshold for what a business decision should be made of? I don't know. I think you can make arguments for a wide number of different thresholds. You can make an argument for, I want to be 70% sure that it's a good decision. If I'm 70% sure it's a good decision, and if not, then I won't do it, but I don't need to be 95% confident, right? You could even go the opposite way. If there's a change that I want to make that I think is going to be better for the business, and I understand my customers, I understand my product, I understand my industry, and as a result of that deep understanding of the problem space, I make this change, shouldn't you need to be confident that I'm wrong? Shouldn't it be the opposite? Instead of rejecting the null hypothesis, shouldn't you have to reject the new hypothesis that's based on deep industry understanding and customer knowledge? Maybe you want to be 80% sure that my decision was bad before you reverse it, instead of 80% sure that the decision was good before you accept it, right? Point number one, 95% confidence interval for A/B tests in the business context do not make sense. Next, in an A/B test, you are assuming the results that you find are going to continue to be true in the long term. And I will give a great example of this. In the startup world, so much has changed because over the last 2 years, interest rates have changed substantially. We've gone from essentially 0% interest rates, which drove massive amounts of different behaviors in the industry, to interest rates at substantially higher levels, which means that the required returns for a lot of the money that gets invested into venture capital is a lot higher. I have never seen anybody ever say that all of the A/B tests that we ran 2 years ago, maybe those were only true in an era of zero interest rates. Maybe we should go back and look at those A/B tests to see if they remain true for a higher interest rate environment. And it's a perfect example of how we're playing experiments with these A/B tests, because we've got this false sense of overconfidence in a real experiment where you're looking at finding a truth. That truth is not supposed to change. But in business, it changes all the time. And the way that we do A/B tests don't account for that. There's a lot more I could say about this, but I'm going to go on to point number 3. Extreme short-termism around metrics and impact versus long-term business impact. There are many ways that companies can trade off short-term results and long-term results. There are things that you can do to apply high-pressure selling and other things that will make it look like your conversion rates get better in the short term. And then we say, oh, this metric went up from this change. Great. But what it doesn't take into account is that over the next year, the customer repurchase rate or the churn rate is going to drop substantially as a result. And I have seen so many times where even if you do have a good result for a short term from a specific metric because your conversion rate gets better or something like that, it doesn't take into account that you might be trading off long-term business impact. And for example, there have been tests that I've seen around pricing where you hide pricing until further on in the process, or people get to the checkout page when they're at the end of something and then the pricing becomes higher than they thought it was earlier, right? In a short-term way, that's going to increase the average customer checkout value because you're just adding in extra fees at the end and you're going to end up with a better result. But long-term, do people get pissed off and not buy from you as much? The A/B test doesn't test that, does it? Issue number 4, optimizing changes for meaningless metrics. And a perfect example of this is when you're looking at a funnel, you have your A/B test success be getting to the next step of the funnel. And from a business impact perspective, that doesn't mean anything, right? If you have a 3-step funnel, you could very easily improve the conversion from step 1 to step 2, and then at the same time, with the exact same change, decrease the conversion from step 2 to step 3. And so your actual customer checkout might be the exact same, or it might be worse. You might get less revenue from a successful A/B test. And frankly, it's because you're optimizing the change for this meaningless metric because it's just in the middle of a long process. Next, problem number 5. Looking at a single metric, when from a business perspective, you should probably look at multiple metrics. And frankly, the last example was a good one here. You shouldn't just be looking at conversion rate from step 1 to step 2. You should also be looking at completion of the funnel rate. You should be looking at average customer order. You should be looking at various different metrics as opposed to just that one. But in practice and in the world of science and academia, which is where we have mindlessly copied a lot of this A/B testing process from, you don't want to do that. You just want to look at this very specific narrow thing to understand the truth of that very specific item. Again, that's not what you want to do from a business context most of the time. Next, point number 6. When you look at a basket of metrics, you substantially increase the statistical noise, which means the validity of the test results decrease. When you look at a basket of metrics, it means that all the individual points in your test have a higher chance of being wrong, and there's a higher likelihood that any positive or negative result is just statistical noise. And in order to account for this, you actually need to use a statistical correction. Otherwise, incorrect way you would be looking at things if you look at a basket of metrics. So that's category 1. Category 2 is that even if we didn't have these theoretical challenges with A/B testing that don't fit well for business contexts and business use cases, even if all of those theoretical problems were solved, the technical implementation of A/B testing is very poor. And I have seen so many problems with the way that A/B testing is implemented, to the point that even if we didn't have any theoretical problems, just us as an industry, our inability to implement things correctly would already be enough to say, maybe we shouldn't even be doing it because overwhelmingly we're messing it up. Number 7. When you add up the results of the A/B test, they don't even close to match the business results. I had a friend of mine, a fellow executive, who wrote a tweet about this one time, and he said that if he had taken all of the improvements to the business that his conversion rate team and the product team had shared over the course of a year, that he would have expected that the business would have grown by something like 14,000%, because this was a 100% increase. Then we even 100% increased it again, and we 100% increased it again, right? And you had all of these big changes that were indicated on these A/B tests. Meanwhile, revenue was like 10% up. And that is something that if you're a business leader who is seeing the results of the A/B tests versus the business results, it happens all the time. And I recommend that if you have an A/B testing team, you should go and look back at all of the metrics behind those A/B test results over the last year, and then look at your actual numbers over the last year. And I would be shocked if you didn't see a pretty big disconnect, because I have almost always seen a big disconnect. So go through that exercise and post in the comments. I'd love to see. I hope that people are not facing this. I actually hope that more teams than I expect are finding that they only thought that they were going to grow by 12% and actual growth was 15% or something like that. But I imagine that's not the case, and that's never been the case anywhere that I've seen it. Number 8, vendor methodology issues where the results are just wrong. I have experienced various bugs and various issues with A/B testing vendors where either their internal systems were wrong, so they messed up and they just didn't calculate things correctly, or there was something wrong with the implementation where there was a race condition in JavaScript, and so certain people didn't get tagged and other people did. And so many times there have just been technical issues where the results of an A/B test that I thought were correct turned out to be wrong. That's number 8. Number 9, widespread A tests failing to deliver the same result. If you have an A/B testing system and you haven't run an A test recently, then you should go and do that immediately. And for everybody that doesn't know, an AA test is, with an A/B test, you're testing two different variations, and you're trying to see, is variation one better or worse than variation B? An AA test just tests your system. It says, hey, we're going to have the exact same group. We're not going to make any changes, but we're going to test to see if group one with no changes is different than group two with no changes. And very often you will find that your A/B test system comes back with, oh, this group did much better than the other group. And it leaves you with, what? How did that happen? There was no difference. In fact, we know there was no difference. Someone had shared a story that they were A/B testing the machine learning model, and based on the results of their A/B test with a model change that they had done, they had justified the existence of their whole team because their model was driving tens of millions of dollars of improved results because they were able to increase conversion rates by 0.5% or whatever it was. Like, being able to tie that increased conversion rate to a number that justified the existence of this entire whole team. And then a couple of months later, they did an AA test, and it turned out that the AA test showed that there was a big difference between A and A, to the point that now they don't even know if they can go back in time to say, hey, our whole team is justified based off of the results of this A/B test that is run on a system that we can't trust, because when we ran an A test, it didn't give us the same numbers. So run an AA test if you are running an A/B testing framework in production. And if it doesn't come back the same, then you should have a serious think about whether it's even worth keeping it. All right. Next, number 10, running large numbers of concurrent tests on the same users and struggling to disentangle the results. I think actually the tooling has gotten a lot better on this, where most of the more modern A/B testing systems do a better job at being able to run these tests concurrently. So that said, this has been an issue. It is oftentimes still complicated. I think some of the newer systems are better at it. Number 11, a strong result is as likely to be a bug as a business change. And frankly, there was a famous paper, I think out of Microsoft or LinkedIn a while ago, that stated this, that the better your result was of an A/B test, the more likely it was to be a bug in either your A/B testing code or a bug within the happy path of one of your, like a code bug, right? Oh, we didn't trigger the event, or obviously people can't check out because we removed the checkout button, right? Like some major issue, versus actually the A/B test is showing that this new result is better than the old result. Beyond that, reconfirming good test results gets very tricky. So what do? You have an A/B test and it turns out great. So now what comes next? Do you run it again? Because when you see a really strong result, what that means is that it's likely wrong. I don't think most teams do, even though they know the stronger the result, the more likely it is to be a bug versus a real business change. Whew. All right. A lot of issues. We still got some more. Next, number 12, widespread P hacking. P hacking is where you try to get something to exactly 0.95, the 95% confidence that something is correct. And so you get like all of these, oh yes, we had a 0.2% change, but we're 95. It is statistically significant because we got the P value to 0.95. And so this is a win, right? Really, that tiny little change that is essentially meaningless, that yes, is technically statistically significant, but it's probably just P hacking. Number 13 is peaking. There's this thing with experimentation where you're supposed to wait for the full audience size that you need to get a test result in, and that if you peak and then make changes and then things go up and down in the meanwhile, you're not supposed to do it. I actually don't have as much of a problem with peaking, because I'll get to that in a little bit around how I think about experimenting and using experiment results as opposed to A/B testing. So I'm more in favor of peaking, but technically, because of the amount of peaking, the scientific correctness of A/B testing is diminished because of the peaking. I personally don't care as much about the academically scientific correctness, but point number 13, peaking. Number 14, vendor incentive issues to let non-technical users run A/B tests and then run themselves totally off a cliff. I have seen many cases where just the tooling that vendors give to a product manager or to a marketer to go and run A/B tests, and it just is a total mess. It's easy to set up the experiments incorrectly. It's very easy to misinterpret them. It's very easy to just totally mess everything up. And then again, in the past, I have seen some particularly egregious examples of this where it's in vendors' best interest to let people see wins. And there have been some cases where the product managers want to see a win. And so from a UX perspective, let people see a win, even though was that really a win? It's just been sketchy. Again, I don't want to name names for vendors. And I think the bigger point is that everybody who is saying, yes, take this like extremely challenging statistical process and just put a point and click interface on top in JavaScript inside a website where we think it's going to run in a certain way and let the marketers do it. And if it's messed up, okay, whatever, but they bought it. And so they're using it and they're happy. I've seen a little too much of that. All right. And then the final category, even I'm tiring myself out talking about all of these points. All right. Point number 15, the final category, it just doesn't understand realistic decision-making in companies. If an A/B test comes back with a small but statistically significant negative impact, does that really mean you shouldn't ship it? If I think that I am making an improvement for the business and the A/B test comes back and says, no, it was a 0.2% decrease in the metric you were measuring and it's statistically significant, does that really mean you shouldn't ship it if I think it's going to be better for customers in the long run? No. You should probably ship it. Probably doesn't mean that it's some massive improvement. And if you thought it was going to be a massive improvement and then it was essentially no change, then that's a separate conversation to be had. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it. Next, even if you use a 95% threshold with hundreds of tests, then you'll have many tests that have statistically significant results that are incorrect. That's just 1 out of 20 tests are going to say that they're significant and they're not. There's a famous XKCD on this where it's like they test, do lollipops cause cancer? And they do the test and it's no, lollipops don't cause cancer. And then they say, oh, maybe it's the color. Maybe a specific color of lollipop causes cancer. So let's test them all. And they're like, all right, fine. Does red cause cancer? No. Does blue cause cancer? No. Does yellow cause cancer? No. Does orange cause cancer? No. Does green cause cancer? Yes. Does black cause cancer? No. Does brown cause cancer? No. And then they've got the 20 and then it just green came back with a yes result. And so the headline is green lollipops cause cancer, when really it's just randomly, if you test enough, you're going to have things that are wrong. And if you take that original point number 1, that 95% is way too high a bar in the first place, it should probably be 80, 70%, then this gets far worse. And then when you look at a basket of metrics, instead of just one metric, it gets far worse again, because what's going to very likely happen is that you're going to look at 5 metrics, and of those 5 metrics, one of them is just going to be statistically significant randomly. And at that point, what do you even do? Exactly. All right. Point number 17. What are the consequences of moving more slowly because you're doing A/B testing? And this is where businesses aren't considering the opposite. Like A/B testing in many cases for many businesses is slow because you need to take a lot of time to get enough users for what are smaller changes oftentimes to get to statistical significance. And so what ends up happening is you have this big headwind against making forward progress as a business, because anytime that you make changes, you have this A/B testing infrastructure that's like, all right, you made a change. Great. Now let's wait 2 weeks and see how that change was. And then we'll interpret the results. Oh, wow, the results are a little inconclusive. It says that it was a slight negative. Now what should we do? Do I have to go to my boss and tell them, hey, there was a slight negative on this? And then they're going to say, if it's bad, wouldn't we want to roll it back? And then what are you going to say? Oh, no, it was bad, but it was only a little bad. And yes, it was statistically significant, but it wasn't big enough. The whole thing, it just gets to be this massive drag on experimentation, frankly. Instead of making it easier to experiment, it makes it more difficult to experiment. All right. My last point, number 18, I think that we lose something when we take away from the most important thing being your deep understanding of the business and your customers and your product, and then using that deep understanding to go and make decisions. And when we take that away and we try to make it seem like this is a data problem to be solved, and all you need to do is do things and A/B test them, and then that's going to tell you what to do with your business. It's going to tell you what your customers are going to want. I just don't think that's true. And I think that when we try to make something that ultimately is not measurable in this way and try to force it to be measured in this framework, we lose something. And that is my final challenge, point number 18. Now, I will say some domains are better for A/B testing, right? Content headlines, ad copy, fine-tuning game mechanics, etc. Things that even if you know your product or your customers, like you don't know what headlines are going to be appealing or not. Sometimes with game mechanics, tuning those can be tricky. So you need to experiment. You need to do that. But even then, traditional A/B testing falls short because of the time requirements, right? If you have a content headline that you're testing, you can't run a long A/B test and then go back and analyze the results and then decide which to keep, because by then the audience is already gone. They've moved on to another content piece. Instead, you still want to experiment, but you'd probably want to use something like a multi-arm bandit test where you're not missing the opportunity because you've got some big A/B test. Instead, in a multi-arm bandit, what it does is it uses like some percentage of the visitors that come in to experiment. So say 10% that come in, you'll experiment on. And then for the other 90%, it's just picking the best head. So imagine you have 5 headline options. And it just, for 10% of the time, it keeps flipping through those options to see what the conversion rate of them all is. And for the other 90%, it just picks the winner and shows it to everybody. Okay, so if we're not going to do A/B testing, what should you do? My answer is yes on experiments. In fact, way more experiments than you would otherwise do while you're sitting back waiting patiently for weeks for A/B tests to come in, right? Just test things and move more quickly without needing to sit and wait around. And when you're judging if things are working, like you made a change, is it working or not? You should be looking at big shifts versus tiny shifts. It is so common that even when A/B tests come back with results, it's, wow, you changed like 0.25%, or this one is very slightly better than the other one. Most experiments come back with tiny changes. It's also very likely that these changes are just statistical noise and not actual changes to the business. At the point that you're excited about a tiny 1% change, you already lost the plot, because that's not doing enough to move the needle for the business, right? The business doesn't need super tiny changes that don't mean that much. The business needs changes that are so obviously good that you don't need an A/B test. You can just look at it, right? There was an example that one of the teams where I was working on something, right? We thought this model change would fix a very common customer complaint. And so we deployed it. And then the next month, our customer complaints dropped by 70%. It was obvious. We thought this was going to happen. We did it. We saw that it happened. And if the customer complaints had only dropped by 2%, but it was statistically significant, like who cares, right? You shouldn't be thinking in terms of such small changes. And another example of a test that I've done where we're trying to track user activity across like browsing behavior. And it was like, are people using a nav bar or are they searching? And it turned out that 92% of people were doing category-based navigation as opposed to the 8% that were doing the search bar. We didn't need to get some fine-grained, statistically significant A/B test to understand the difference in user behavior. It was just blatantly obvious what the difference in user behavior is. That's what you should be targeting. You should be targeting things that are blatantly obvious. Now, monitor your metrics. Monitoring your metrics is extremely important. If and when things get out of whack, you do need to check to see what's going on and to see what recently got deployed, what things people are doing on your site, and you need to look into that and to see what's driving those changes. But that is very different than taking this rigorous scientific approach in business that does not fit the problems that you're trying to solve for business. All right. So that's the case. Those are my challenges with A/B testing. That is how I think businesses should be thinking about how to test an experiment in a way that's not the sort of very standard traditional A/B testing. And I know that many people will likely strongly disagree with me. And in fact, like I said at the beginning, I am making this case, but I might be wrong. So if you think I'm wrong, please post your strongest rebuttals in the comments. Help me understand how, with all of these challenges and with all of these both theoretical problems as well as implementation problems, you still think that we should be doing A/B testing. But as you do that, as you're telling me why A/B testing is so important, think about this. Given that it's impossible to A/B test the very expensive and strategic decision to do A/B testing at your company, why do you feel confident disagreeing with me? And doesn't your disagreement prove my point that maybe A/B testing isn't necessary? All right. I'm looking forward to seeing the comments on this one.